Hey guys, it's W3Sure, and today we are looking into a, let's say, Wild West scenario where a short stack from late position is all in. Here in our research. It's either the button or the cutoff with a very high bounty power, so a very short stack with a high bounty power, and how the blinds should react because they should fight for this bounty. And the blinds will have significant stacks, so 50 BB and more. And yeah, let's look into the solutions, how the blinds should react against this short stack all in. And yeah, first of all, we will look into the equilibrium or GTO solution, and from that we will derive the always printing solution. So something which you can rely on. Doesn't matter if your opponent in the big blind is like very tight or like very aggressive. You can just close your eyes and say, okay, those combos are always good. And then we will look into the situation that when we are in the small blind and we are covered, and the big blind is very aggressive, like how we should probably change our strategy in the small blind compared to the GTO strategy. And also we will look into the big blind strategy if the small blind is trapping a lot of combos instead of ripping them themselves, like how we want to proceed in the big blind. And then we will flip it around and let the big blind be covered. So in the points 1 and 2, the big blind will cover the small blind, and in point 3, the small blind will cover the big blind. And we will also look into the GTO solution and some exploitative plays. And in the end, we will change the open jamming range from the late position player, which has a high bounty power, to yeah, much tighter range, and see if the blinds are reacting differently. You will notice this setup from the presentation before, where we did study how button versus small blind versus big blind is playing. It's the same setup, so we have again a $100 PKO, $50 in a regular prize pool, $50 in a bounty prize pool. All prizes are on first place, and you have the regular $50, which are the total KO, and you can only win $25 from this total KO if you knock out the player. And here we have the situation that the button only has 3,000 chips from this 20k starting stack, so he has a very high bounty power, 6.6. Yeah, so approximately 6.7 bounty power here. And yeah, this situation is that everyone folds to the button jams all in. How should the blinds react? You see the big blind has 75 big blinds and the small blind has 50 big blinds. This is the all-in range from the button. I think this is quite realistic if you play on like regularly, quote-unquote, a little bit higher stakes, or if people are not like feeling the ICM impact and that they have to ladder. So this is a early stage example which I took, so that people don't feel like the impact of ICM that much. And I think it's quite realistic. Of course, you can argue if people are jamming hand like King 6 offsuit or Queen 4 suited because they think, yeah, I'm getting called anyways all the time, and probably this is not enough equity. And yeah, therefore we will make this open jamming range much tighter in point 4. But for now, we take the GTO open jamming range, which is approximately 43%. Now we want to look into the small blind GTO response against the button open rip. So the small blind here has 50 big blinds, the big blind has 75 big blinds, and this is the GTO solution. And what you can see is for 50 big blinds, the small blind rips approximately 33% of all combos. So it is a very large ripping range here. And what you can also see is that small blind will trap with his very top range, so aces down to jacks. And then, let's say, King Queen suited is also a combination which is value. And then he will add like the very worst hands, which you can find as a call. So quite polar strategy for calling, and in terms of jamming, it's a high card driven jamming strategy here. In case that the small blind only calls still in from the button, you can see on the right side the big blind response. So we are ripping essentially all of our value hands besides our aces and sometimes kings. We call essentially everything which has a little bit of multi-way equity, I would say, or high card equity. and yeah, we only fold approximately 28% here, so like this very bottom triangle which you can see here. So that's a big blind strategy in the GTO case. Everything is quite wide, so for the case that we're like 50 big blinds effective, you can see a lot of all-in is going on here. And versus a jam, so button goes all in and then small blind rejams, it's 50 big blind stack. You can also see that big blind is calling quite wide, so big blind is calling a hand like king 8 or king 9. Big blind is calling a hand like king 6 suited in the GTO case, or 9-7 suited sometimes, king 3, etc. And the question is, for this wide west scenario, what is the stable range here? So where we can always close our eyes and say, okay, this is always good to call off here the 50 big blinds from the small blind. And when you look into the EVs, you can again say, okay, let's take like this 10% of aces limit. You can also go a little bit into deeper research and say, okay, this is the dollar amount, the minimum of dollar amount I want to make in a specific hand, and then you probably lower or upper your limit dependent on your personal taste. I just take now, for sake of simplicity, the borderline 10% of aces, or a little bit tighter. I think I took like approximately a table equity of 2 here, although aces quote unquote only 16.3% table equity plus EV. And then you can see it's ace 5 offsuit, king 10 offsuit, queen jack, all pairs, and king 9 and all suited aces. So ace x really strong, every pair really strong, and then all suited broadways and suited good multi-way equity hands with a high card. Those are the hands which are going in. Now we want to go into the first exploit and look into an big blind which is like really aggressive if we call from the small blind the all-in from the button. And on the left side I just locked the hands, so I did lock everything down to king deuce offsuit, so like essentially any ace and any king is jammed if the small blind only calls, so like really high card heavy rejam, and then rejams and the Broadway part, and to rejams and the suited connected part here, of course every pair, and then he VPips non-all in like all the hands which have like either a high card or have like a little bit of connectivity and suitedness. And if that is the case, then small blind will respond by not jamming as much. So if you go back, this is the small blind GTO response, and you can see that we are jamming here 33% approximately. Had quite a polar strategy to call. And now if we go into the small blind response, we are now jamming only 23%, so we lose 10% of our jamming range, and we go into a more linear calling strategy and call our aces, kings, queens, jacks, tens. We call our suited broadways, we call our ace king suited, we call a lot of those suited aces, and we essentially now rip the bottom. Yeah, so this is the small blind response here. Note that we essentially go into a zero call fold strategy, so we are not having like any combination which we are VPipping and not broking, no matter what the big blind does. So if we are calling, the big blind rips, then we call off our entire range, which we did call pre-flop, and the rest of the range which we want to VPip, we just jam ourselves. We're comparing this again here, the small blind GTO solution and the small blind versus this very aggressive big blind, which will rip a lot of his hands if we only call against the button all in. And you can see that we now turn our very bottom either into folds here and here, or we turn our very bottom into jams. So here we had full frequency call king 6, full frequency call queen 8, we lose this, we rip now queen 9 fully, we rip now partly jack 9, we rip fully king 10, we rip mostly 8-7, so like this whole vibe of the solution is go into zero call fold node, jam the bottom by yourself, and develop a more trappy, more linear calling strategy against an aggressive big blind. we lose approximately 5% VPIP, and we go into zero call fold. I already said that. We jam the new bottom instead of call folding, and we are increasing our calling range linear in terms of equity. Then we have the classic small blind, which is like calling because the button has such a nice bounty, but he's calling too much and he's not putting in enough traps. So this is a range which I constructed here on the left side. I think it's quite realistic for this kind of player. So he will trap with his queens, kings, aces, and then he will just call his like very bottom of his range which he wants to see. He jams some of the hands which have like nice multi-way equity, like 9-8, 8-7, but not all of them. Sometimes calling Jack 10 suited, 10-9 suited, sometimes jamming 9-8 suited, 8-7 suited. I did not like mix the combos, so I just said, okay, sometimes he's doing that, sometimes he's doing that, but in like the general construction of the ranges, he has like some good combos, but most of the combos which he overcalls against the button order are not good. And what you can see in the big blind response in terms of GTO is that the big blind is increasing his rejams against this overcalling range from the small blind by ripping his high cards. In this direction and in this direction, in the queen X direction, he still takes like all suited kings, all suited aces, and then adds more and more off-suited kings, off-suited queens, and he also rips like all of the small pairs, which he did not do before. If we go to the big blind response before versus call, you can see like the small pairs are called, and those off-suited king X and the queen X hands are called against the button open jam small blind call, and now we are in the response where we start ripping all of the suited queen X, off suited king X, all of the pairs. So big blind will add against the player which is trapping but not trapping enough, or like calling too many weak hands. This is the same like not trapping enough because he does not support his weak hands by good hands, right? He's responding by ripping more by himself, and also you can see he VPIPs 100% now in the suited range. Before we had like a mix here in this range, in this part of the range where he did sometimes call, sometimes fold, and now we are calling the full suited range, and also a bunch of combos in the off suited range which are like connected okay-ish multi-way equity. Now we can flip this around and say the small blind now has 75 big blinds and the big blind has 50 big blinds. Now the small blind covers the big blind. And you can see a complete shift in strategy from the small blind. Before we had like really a polar approach in terms of what we want to call and what we want to jam. And it's still a polar approach, what we want to call, what we want to jam. But overall, we are jamming way more. So we are now jamming 50% here in this case. Before we did jam in the GTO case 33% approximately. And we did have here a bunch of calls and to support our bottom. And now we still have a bottom. We still support our bottom with the aces, kings, but our bottom is like way more bottom, if that makes sense. Now we are ripping essentially like any queen, essentially any king, and our new bottom is way lower compared to the solution before. So we are jamming a lot. And you can see the big blind, this is the big blind versus the small blind all in the GTO case. Big blind calls like rule of thumb approximately the same range in the GTO perspective. So again, it's ace 5, now it's king 10, queen jack, pairs down to pocket 4s. Before we had pocket 5s, now we have pocket 4s, and we have again now king 9, from king 9 suited to king 8 suited up, and every suited ace. So we add like some more combos to our calls, to our stable range, but our stable range like essentially it's still the same stable range. Before we had ace 5 king jack, I think, and now we have ace 5 king 10 pocket 4s instead of pocket 5s, and king 8 suited instead of king 9 suited, right? So this is the stable range in terms of EV, which we can call off against a GTO or playing small blind where we think the small blind is wide enough in its jams to call off. And now we can say, okay, if the big blind would have done like all the studies, and he only calls the stable range, right? So a big blind which is overfolding against a small blind rip, we would overfold. If we only go here and call the stable range, we of course would overfold here in the ace-x bottom in the pairs and stuff. So if we overfold, what is the new small blind reaction? And I took the big blind stable range as a call, and then we go over here and look into the new small blind strategy. And now we can see again we develop calling range. Before, we essentially don't have a really big calling range. We only have 6% calls, so like a sliver of like our bottom offsuit combos, and then aces and kings to support. And now we have 19% calls, so like a bunch of like linear top range aces, kings, queens, jacks, and we support this also with our suited broadways. And then we add like a lot at the bottom, like 10-3 suited, 10-2 suited, queen 5, queen 4. So since the calling range is a little bit stronger, we don't want to broke like that wide in terms of our bottom, and also we want the big blind to enter the pot. So we add a bunch of good hands to our calling range in the small blind. Now we can go another step further. So I think like the assumption that big blind will not call his range in the slide before here, this like full range, but only the stable range, I think this assumption is quite valid. So we can go one step ahead and say, okay, we like by default want to play most of the times our like mixed solution. We want to add a good amount of traps in our calls against the button all in, and we want to also mix in a good amount of like trash okay high card equity, so that we can enter the pot against the button but not lose as much against the strong big blind calling range if we would go all in. So this would be our like new defined strategy which we want to play. And now what is the big blind response against this like polar trapping small blind, right? So we have like this side of our pole which is like the good side, and then we have the bad side here at the bottom. And what is the big blind response now? And you can see that the big blind response is that we essentially jam our stable range. So we take our like let's say ace 5 and then king 10 and then rip our pairs, pocket eights, king 10 suited, and all suited aces. So it does not like differ that much. We lose some pairs, so that's like the biggest difference here. We lose some pairs which would like not call, which would not rip against the new small blind strategy, but rather call and see a flop and play in position, instead of the case before where the small blind did rip and then we had to call off all small pairs. But like the whole theme is that most of the combinations are played the same way. Doesn't really matter how the small blind plays, if he is using a polar calling strategy pre-flop, so trapping enough and calling enough trash and jamming the rest, or if he is playing GTO, in which in terms of jamming what we want to call off the range, looks like kind of the same in the big blind. Now the last thing which we want to look at is if the small blind traps here, but he's not trapping like that polar, so not that kind of like very bad combos, but like a little bit stronger here and like a little bit more linear here. So like very linear trapping, like less here and more here, if that makes sense. More top combos and less bad combos. And I just did this construct the range that way, that small blind traps down to a hand like queen 10 suited, and then adds a little bit here, adds a little bit here high cards, and adds like all offsuited king x, which he doesn't want to jam. And that's the construction of like our toy game, like how a trappy small blind would probably construct this range. So put in the ace kings, put the pairs down to tens, and then put in some good suited broadways and some bad broadways and some high cards. And what you can see here on the right is that the big blind now really goes into just call and play post flop. Also traps with his aces and his kings. Only realizes his equity with like queens down to nines and his like good ace-x combinations. Those combinations are going in, and the rest of the range is just called. So summary exploits: if the big blind overfolds versus the jam, we are going into a way wider polar flagging strategy. Before we did rip a lot, and now we are going into 19% calling compared to like 6% calling, what it was in the GTO solution. So we're going a way wider flagging strategy, playing post flop and playing against the most likely weakish holding of the big blind as well. And if the small blind traps like a lot, like he does here, so but more linear, so I'm referring to that case here, where the small blind traps more linear, more high cards, more good hands in the trapping range, then we go into less ISO jams in the big blind and we play post flop. We're only ripping essentially our good ace X and our good pairs, and with the rest of our range we are playing post flop. The last case which we want to discuss is that people might jam tighter, and we can also think about probably a cutoff is open jamming, then the button folds, and then we have the same situation. So either the button is tighter, or let's say a cutoff open jams, and cutoff loses here a whole 8% VPIPing, down from like 42 something percent down to 34%, and honestly, this is the tightest I can imagine. Player with 8 big blinds at the start, or close to the start of a PKO, is playing, let's say, with 25% of the field busted, like something like that, right? So, like, not deep in the tournament, no ICM considerations. We're kind of crippled with our 8 big blinds on the button or at the cutoff, and yeah, this is more or less like the tightest range I can imagine. And the question is, if the solution somehow changes, if the player, which is open jamming all in, loses a bunch of combos. And yeah, the answer is no, essentially no. So here, from the small blind against the GTO button, which VPIPs like 44% or so, is all in with 56%, and here we are all in versus the tight button with 52%. So yeah, the small blind response is unchanged, and because the small blind response is unchanged, and there are a lot of combos, and big blind covers small blind here in this solution, the big blind response is also unchanged. So like in terms of mindset, if people in late positions are jamming too tight in your head, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter for your blind response. The bounty which is at play makes up like a lot in terms of equity, so you cannot tighten up that much, even if the players are losing like 25% of the range which they should open jam. You still play the same strategy with the same combinations. Now we can also flip this around and say, okay, now big blind covers the small blind. Is there any difference in how the small blind should react against the open jam, which is now tighter? And on the left side you see again versus the GTO button solution, on the right side versus the tight button solution, and essentially it's the same range, right? So 32.7% all in, 31% all in, 10% call, 11% call. It's essentially the same construction of the range. Yeah, you lose a little bit here at the bottom, and you play here and there a combo more aggressive, like a 9-7 suited, you would rejam more often, you call it more often, but this is just like detailed difference. It's not changing the whole like strategy which we did craft in this video. It's still for our strategy in the small blind. We go into polar calling range pre-flop, we add some traps, and we essentially rip the rest. We call our bottom, we call our top, and we rip the rest in between. And the big blind response, because the small blind response is essentially unchanged, is again, of course, also unchanged. So the open jamming range doesn't matter. I would not say it doesn't matter at all, but it does not matter like so much that you should change your strategy. That's it for me for today, guys. Thanks for watching, and good luck at the tables. Bye bye.